The United States has 6 different ways it could financially collapse in 2026, and according to Treasury data released last month, we're currently on track for at least 3 of them simultaneously. Look, most people think America's too big to fail, that we can just keep printing money forever, that our debt doesn't actually matter because we're the reserve currency. Those people are about to learn a very expensive lesson. Right now, the US national debt sits at $36 trillion. That's trillion with a T. We're adding another trillion in debt every 100 days. Interest payments alone just hit $1.2 trillion annually, more than we spend on defense. But here's what makes 2026 different. We're not facing one crisis. We're facing 6 potential nightmare scenarios, each one capable of triggering economic devastation on its own. And the terrifying part, they're all connected. One triggers another, which triggers another, like dominoes made of dynamite. So in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to walk you through all 6 paths to disaster, show you which one's most likely, and explain what it means for your savings, your job, and your future. Because ignoring this won't make it go away. Before we dive into the 6 scenarios, you need to understand why 2026 specifically is the inflection point. First, we've got massive debt rollovers coming. The Treasury needs to refinance over $7 trillion in maturing bonds this year alone. That's $7 trillion in old debt that needs to be replaced with new debt at much higher interest rates than when we originally borrowed it. Second, the interest rate environment has fundamentally changed. We spent a decade borrowing at near 0%. Now 10-year treasuries are yielding over 4%. Do the math on $36 trillion and you'll see why the interest payments are crushing us. Third, the political calendar matters. 2026 is a midterm election year, which historically means fiscal discipline goes out the window. Both parties will be spending like crazy to buy votes, adding fuel to an already raging fire. Fourth, international confidence is wavering. Foreign holdings of US treasuries dropped by $400 billion in the last 6 months of 2025. When the world stops wanting to hold your debt, very bad things happen very quickly. Fifth, we're running out of accounting tricks. The Treasury has already used every gimmick in the book to keep borrowing. The extraordinary measures, the debt ceiling suspensions, the creative bookkeeping. We're at the end of the rope. And sixth, the economic fundamentals are weak. Growth is slowing, unemployment is ticking up, corporate profits are falling, tax revenues are declining. The foundation is crumbling while the debt keeps growing. This is why 2026 isn't just another year of deficit spending. It's the year where multiple crises converge and the system breaks. Now let me show you exactly how it breaks. Scenario 1 is a sudden loss of confidence in US Treasury bonds, the bedrock of the entire global financial system. Here's how it unfolds. Investors, both foreign and domestic, wake up one morning and collectively decide that US debt is too risky at current yields. Maybe it's triggered by a debt ceiling standoff. Maybe China dumps $1 trillion in treasuries for geopolitical reasons. Maybe a credit rating downgrade from AAA finally happens. Whatever the trigger, yields spike dramatically. The 10-year treasury goes from 4% to 7% in a matter of weeks. Sounds technical, but let me translate what this means for you. Mortgage rates immediately jump to 10 or 11%. The housing market freezes completely. Nobody can afford to buy, existing homeowners are trapped, construction stops, real estate values crater, car loans become unaffordable, credit card rates hit 30%, student loan refinancing becomes impossible, consumer spending, which is 70% of the economy, falls off a cliff. But here's where it gets truly catastrophic. The government's interest payments explode. Remember, we need to refinance $7 trillion this year. If we're refinancing at 7% instead of 4%, that's an extra $200 billion in annual interest costs, just from that one batch of debt. The federal budget implodes. We're forced to choose between paying interest on debt or funding Social Security, Medicare, defense, everything else. There is no good choice. Every option leads to severe pain. The Fed faces an impossible dilemma. Raise rates to defend the Treasury market and cause a depression, or print money to buy bonds and trigger hyperinflation. Timeline. This could happen in months. Treasury markets can turn awfully fast when confidence breaks. And once it starts, stopping it is nearly impossible. Probability, I'd say 20% for 2026. Low probability, but apocalyptic consequences. Scenario 2 is loss of reserve currency status and a collapsing dollar. For decades, the world has used dollars for international trade. held dollars as reserves, priced commodities in dollars. This gives us an enormous privilege. We can print money and export inflation to everyone else. We can run massive deficits because the world needs dollars. But what if that ends? China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and others have been actively working to reduce dollar dependence, creating alternative payment systems, trading oil in yuan, settling bilateral trade in local currencies, accumulating local reserves. In this scenario, a tipping point gets reached. Maybe the BRICS countries announce a gold-backed alternative currency. Maybe Saudi Arabia starts accepting yuan for oil. Maybe the EU decides to assert independence from dollar dominance. Whatever the catalyst, international demand for dollars drops sharply. All those dollars that were sitting in foreign central banks and corporate treasuries come flooding back to the US. This is monetary inflation on steroids. The money supply effectively doubles as decades of exported dollars return home. Prices for everything skyrocket. But here's the vicious cycle. As the dollar weakens, it becomes even less attractive to hold. More countries dump dollars, which weakens it further, which causes more dumping. A death spiral. Imported goods become incredibly expensive. Your iPhone goes from $1,200 to $3,000. Gas goes from $4 a gallon to $12. Anything made overseas or made with imported components quintuples in price. American exports become cheaper, which sounds good, except our economy runs on consumption, not exports. And you can't export your way out of a currency crisis when your entire economic model is based on importing cheaps and exporting paper money. The Fed tries to defend the dollar by raising rates, but this crashes the domestic economy. Unemployment spikes. Businesses fail, tax revenues collapse. The deficit explodes even more. Timeline. This is a slow burn that could accelerate rapidly. Probably 18 to 36 months from first warning signs to full crisis. Probability. I'd say 15% for severe dollar crisis in 2026, but 40% for the beginning stages that set up a 2027 or 2028 collapse. Scenario 3 is the sovereign debt trap, where we can't grow our way out and we can't inflate our way out. Here's the mechanism. Our debt to GDP ratio is now 124%, meaning we owe more than our entire economy produces in a year. Historically, when countries cross 130%, bad things happen. Greece, Japan, Italy, these become cautionary tales. The trap works like this. High debt means high interest payments. High interest payments mean less money for productive investments in infrastructure, education, research. Less productive investment means lower economic growth. Lower growth means lower tax revenues and higher debt to GDP ratio. Higher debt to GDP means even higher interest rates as investors demand more yield for increased risk. Higher rates mean even bigger interest payments and even less money for growth. You're stuck in a loop where the debt feeds on itself. Now, typically countries try two escape routes. Grow really fast so GDP rises faster than debt, or inflate the debt away so you're paying it back with cheaper dollars. But what if neither works? Growth is structurally limited. We've got aging demographics, declining productivity growth, and massive underemployment in productive sectors. Hitting 4 or 5% sustained growth isn't realistic, and inflation doesn't help if interest rates are variable or if you're constantly refinancing. You just end up paying higher rates that offset the inflation benefit. In this scenario, we end up like Japan. Decades of stagnation, zombie economy, no real growth, just managing decline. Except Japan is a creditor nation with high savings. We're a debtor nation with negative savings. Our version is worse. What does this look like day to day? Wages stagnate for decades. Living standards slowly decline. Each generation is poorer than the last. Government services get progressively worse as budgets are consumed by interest payments. Infrastructure crumbles. Healthcare quality drops. Education deteriorates. It's not a sudden crash. It's a slow grinding decline that takes 20 or 30 years. Death by 1,000 cuts. Timeline. We're already in the early stages. Full manifestation takes decades. Probability. I'd say 60% we're on this path already. It's the most likely scenario because it's the path of least resistance. Politicians can keep kicking the can down the road, and by the time it's undeniable, they're out of office. Scenario 4 is runaway inflation that destroys savings and crushes the middle class. This happens when the political system decides that explicit default is unacceptable and austerity is politically impossible. So the only remaining option is to inflate the debt away. The Fed, under enormous political pressure, starts monetizing government debt directly. They print money to buy treasuries. keeping yields artificially low while the money supply explodes. In the early stages, this seems to work. The government can keep borrowing, keep spending, keep the system afloat. Markets initially rally because liquidity is flooding the system. But then reality hits. All that new money chases limited goods and services. Prices start rising. 5% inflation becomes 8%, then 12%, then 18%. Workers demand higher wages to keep up with rising costs. Businesses raise prices to cover higher wage costs. This creates a wage price spiral that feeds on itself. The middle class gets destroyed in this scenario. If you've got savings in the bank, a retirement account in bonds, a fixed pension, you're watching your wealth evaporate in real terms. $1 million retirement fund that seemed comfortable. In 3 years of 15% annual inflation, it's worth 60,000 real purchasing power. In 5 years, 497,000. Your nest egg has been cut in half without the nominal number changing. Social Security and Medicare become in real terms even if nominally funded. Government promises to retirees become worthless because the dollars they're paid in buy nothing. Civil unrest increases as people realize they're being robbed by monetary policy. Political extremism rises. Social cohesion breaks down. The Fed eventually has to choose between continuing the inflation and destroying the currency, or slamming on the brakes with massive rate hikes that cause a depression. Either path leads to severe social and economic trauma. Timeline. Once it starts, probably 3 to 5 years to reach crisis levels. Probability, 30% for 2026. This is the path politicians prefer because it's hidden taxation that most people don't understand until it's too late. Scenario 5 is what economists call a sudden stop, where funding just disappears overnight. Imagine the US Treasury goes to auction off $200 billion in new bonds to fund the government, and nobody shows up. Not foreign governments, not pension funds, not banks, nobody. This happened to Greece in 2010, happened to Argentina multiple times, happened to emerging markets during the Asian financial crisis. Investors just collectively decide the risk isn't worth it at any price. In the US context, this would probably be triggered by some combination of factors. A political crisis like an actual debt default from Congress failing to raise the ceiling. A geopolitical shock like a major war. A financial crisis that makes investors flee to actual cash instead of bonds. Whatever the cause, the mechanism is brutal. The Treasury can't raise money. The government can't pay its bills. Social Security checks bounce. Federal employees don't get paid. Government contractors go unpaid. Military operations halt. The Fed is forced to step in as buyer of last resort. But this immediately triggers the inflation scenario. Or they don't step in, and we get immediate austerity, Great Depression-style unemployment, complete collapse of government services. There's no good option. It's choose your disaster. This scenario is the most sudden and shocking. Could literally happen in a single week if the right trigger occurs. Timeline. Could be triggered at any moment by an external shock. Probability. 10% in 2026, but rising each year we don't fix the underlying issues. Scenario 6 is the worst. It's when multiple scenarios happen simultaneously, creating cascade failure across the entire system. Here's how it could unfold. Start with a treasury market problem. Yields spike because foreign buyers step back. The Fed responds by printing money to buy bonds. This weakens the dollar. Dollar weakness causes inflation. Inflation forces the Fed to eventually raise rates. Rate hikes crash the economy. Recession causes tax revenues to collapse. Revenues collapsing makes the deficit worse. Worse deficit scares more bond buyers away. Each problem makes every other problem worse. The solutions to one crisis trigger another crisis. You're trying to put out fires while everything around you is soaked in gasoline. In this scenario, we get simultaneous currency crisis, inflation crisis, debt crisis, and recession. The policy tools that would normally address one problem make the other problems catastrophic. Government completely loses control. Markets are in free fall. Banks are failing. Companies are going bankrupt. Unemployment is spiking. Inflation is raging. The dollar is collapsing. Social services are being cut. Civil unrest is escalating. This is the scenario that changes everything. Not just economically, but politically and socially. Constitutions get rewritten. Political systems get overthrown. The social contract dissolves. Timeline, if triggered, moves from bad to catastrophic in 6 to 12 months. Probability, 5% in 2026. But if we go down any of the other paths and handle them badly, this becomes the eventual destination. So out of these 6 nightmares, which one should you actually prepare for? Based on current trajectory, I think we're looking at scenario 3, the sovereign debt trap, as the most likely path. 60% probability we're already on it. This is the slow decline scenario, not dramatic enough to force immediate action, but devastating over time. Politicians can keep pretending everything's fine while the fundamentals slowly rot. Within that slow decline, we'll probably see mini versions of scenarios 4 and 2, periodic inflation spikes that punish savers, gradual dollar weakening that makes imported goods expensive, not full crisis, but enough to hurt. The wild cards are scenarios 1, 5, and 6, low probability, but if they happen, they're existential. These are the ones triggered by external shocks or political dysfunction. Scenario 1, Treasury collapse, becomes more likely if we have another debt ceiling standoff that goes too far. Scenario 5, sudden stop, becomes more likely if a geopolitical crisis erupts with China or if another pandemic hits. Scenario 6, cascade failure, becomes the destination if policymakers panic and make wrong decisions during any of the other scenarios. The good news, if you can call it that, is we probably won't see sudden apocalypse. The bad news is we're almost certainly facing decades of declining living standards, eroding purchasing power, and diminishing opportunities. 6 paths to disaster. 6 ways the math stops working. 6 scenarios that end with ordinary Americans paying the price for decades of fiscal irresponsibility. The question isn't whether something breaks. The question is which thing breaks first, and whether we have the political courage to make hard choices before we're forced into catastrophic ones. Right now, we're choosing the slow poison over the quick surgery, and every day we wait, the surgery gets more painful and the poison gets more deadly. If this video made you realize how serious this actually is, share it with someone who still thinks the debt doesn't matter. Subscribe because I'll be tracking which scenario we're heading toward as 2026 unfolds. The storm is coming. The only question is whether you'll see it before it hits. Your move.